If you don't believe that there's an epic moral issue in front of us in this election right now in the form of this Gaza war, then I don't know what reality you're living in.
Today on Centre Stage, Jeremy Scahill is one of the most prominent investigative journalists of our time. He's a co-founder of The Intercept and, more recently, Dropsite News. Many recent stories on Dropsite have focused on the war in Gaza. Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much for joining us here.
It's my honor.
Thank
you.
Let's start with what you're doing now. So you're known for The Intercept, which you co-founded. You moved on recently. You launched Dropsite News. Just talk us through the process. Why the move, what Dropsite is, and what it is that you're hoping to achieve there that you couldn't at The Intercept.
My colleague Ryan Grimm and I, who's another great investigative reporter, started Dropsite News, and the way we were thinking about it was to create an adversarial, non-aligned news organization. I think one of the major problems in the American media landscape is so many journalists view themselves as cheerleaders for a particular political candidate or a political party. We're certainly seeing that in an acute way with the 2024 election, and really it's been that way for some years. And calling ourselves adversarial is not actually meant to be a provocation. All journalism should be adversarial toward the powerful. And so what we're trying to do is reject the artificial notion of objectivity that is used as a cudgel against actual independent journalists. We don't believe that journalism is just this side says this and the other side says that. That journalists have an obligation to help listeners, readers, or viewers understand what is factual, but also to understand the historical context. So our view is not trust but verify. Our view is you must always mistrust the views and the statements of the powerful, and then it's our job as journalists to dig through what the facts are. So, we're trying to do aggressive investigative reporting. A part of also what we want to do is stand in solidarity with journalists who are being persecuted. And right now, we're looking at a mass murder campaign being unleashed against the primarily Palestinian journalists of Gaza. And we think it's shameful how silent so many of our colleagues in the US media have been.
Journalism used to be, you were almost immune to all of this, and now the journalists are the targets for the military as well as people who want to target them.
There is almost no example that you could cite that would be more powerful than talking about what has happened to Al Jazeera. Not just the Israelis banning Al Jazeera from reporting out of Israel, but also sending armed thugs to go and raid the Ramallah offices of Al Jazeera. But it's not just Israel. Remember that after 9/11, the United States kicked Al Jazeera off the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The United States bombed Al Jazeera's offices in Afghanistan. Israel is an extreme sort of iteration of so many policies that the United States helped to create and foster. And at the top of that list is, of course, the use of assassination as a quote-unquote legitimate part of policy. But embedded within that is also a war against journalists, a war against whistleblowers. And so, we can talk until we're blue in the face about the anti-democratic actions of the Israeli state, but we must look at the United States' role in creating those conditions.
And this has been one of probably the biggest story of the last year, what is happening with Israel's war on Gaza. From your perspective, when you look at how it's been covered in the West and here in the US, what is it you think that they're missing?
I think that what we're seeing is an erasure of the 76 years of history that preceded the events of October 7th, that preceded the intense genocidal war that Israel has waged against the Palestinians of Gaza. And we have a president in the United States who is perhaps the single most committed defender of Israel in modern political American history. This is a man who spent a half a century either in the US Senate or in the White House, either as vice president or as president, who openly and repeatedly defines himself as a Zionist, who has a multi-decade history of supporting Israel when it's been at its most gratuitously violent. Perhaps the one thing that Joe Biden has firmly has his hand on the steering wheel of is this war. Yes, there probably are tensions between Biden and Netanyahu, but the fact is that none of this would be happening if Joe Biden wasn't supporting it. He could have ended this with one phone call. So there's a dishonesty that permeates the entire American media discourse around the war in Gaza. It's almost like an upside down narrative. The Israelis are portrayed as the victims, when in fact they've killed conservatively more than 40,000 Palestinians, a significant percentage of them women, children, or the elderly. And Joe Biden is not just frustrated with his own old friend Bibi. He's facilitating the entire thing. That is a glaring omission in the media coverage of this war, where Joe Biden has always been there to defend or facilitate Israel's most violent actions. And now, as commander-in-chief, his last months in office are going to be spent providing the kerosene to the Israeli state to set the entire Middle East on fire.
Let's talk about the build-up then, because you've written extensively about Hamas's perspective, and that's something that in the Western media you're not going to be hearing a lot about. I'm just curious to know about, first of all, how you managed to do this and what it was that you learned.
It's not difficult to do an interview with Hamas. I asked them about the taking of small children back to Gaza that day on October 7th, about taking older people. But let's just pause a moment here and remember, we're being told what they were doing was trying to initiate a genocidal war against the Jewish population of Israel. Shouldn't we hear what is their perspective to try to understand how did they perceive the events that led up to October 7th? It's a new phenomenon now where all of a sudden speaking to the quote unquote enemy makes you the enemy too as a journalist. You can go back through history and find American journalists, British journalists, international journalists interviewing the quote unquote other side all the time. We should be talking to the people on the other side of this to fact check some of what our own state says about it, to understand what is their perspective. That doesn't make you pro-Hamas, a supporter of terrorism or anything. It makes you a responsible journalist.
Do you think there is a fear among what I would say traditional journalists, like often referred to as the mainstream media, that they don't want to do this for fear of that?
I'll tell you so.
That way.
It's a great question. I interviewed the number 2 in control of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Mohammed al-Hindi. He had never given an interview to a Western journalist since the early 1980s. It was an utterly fascinating conversation. All these guys have been in and out of prisons. The Israeli prisons, also Palestinian Authority had targeted them. Many of them are very well educated. You may not like their answers, but they give very sophisticated, well thought out answers defending why they did what they did. After I did this series, and these were long articles where we covered the whole terrain of the history, the context, the war, questions about if they had miscalculated what Israel's response was going to be. And I got emails from friends at major newspapers in the United States who said, we wish we could do these kinds of stories. We're just simply not allowed to. There are very strict rules on how you're allowed to quote Hamas at many publications. They may not publicize these, but journalists understand that there is a certain framework that you have to operate in if you want to quote Hamas. There hasn't really been a full hearing for what was the perspective of the people on the other side of this war when they decided to launch that operation on October 7th. And it's not because there aren't journalists that want to do it. It's because their news organizations are not allowing it.
Do you feel worried for yourself, the fact that you've done this?
I traveled in Somalia and Afghanistan. I've interviewed Al-Qaeda figures, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, and I, for years, was on a watch list where every time I would fly back into the country of my own citizenship, the United States, I would have 4 S's on my ticket. I was repeatedly questioned by law enforcement of my own government when I was reporting on the so-called war on terror, when I was traveling to areas where President Obama was authorizing drone strikes. Am I afraid? No, I'm not afraid. But I'm concerned about surveillance. I'm concerned about source protection. But primarily, I'm concerned that we as a country, if we don't embrace the idea of adversarial journalism, of fact-checking our own leaders, then we're going to lose something so fundamental to a democratic society that we won't recognize the world we wake up in if we allow actual journalism to be destroyed.
And now we're in this position where we have almost 2 parallel realities taking place. We've got Joe Biden and the US, his administration, calling for a ceasefire and talking about diplomacy day after day. At the same time, we have the US military building up almost on a daily basis in that part of the world, and the US talking about a ceasefire while it's sending billions of dollars of aid. How can those 2 realities exist? And also, when you consider where we are, there's not very much choice for people here. It's either Donald Trump, who's very pro-Israel, or it's Kamala Harris, who is also towing that same line.
Well, look, one thing that I think is sort of symbolic of the times in which we're living is the recent endorsement of Kamala Harris by Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney. Dick Cheney is one of the most notorious figures in modern American politics. This was a guy who was a main architect of the torture program, the rendition program, who famously said that we have to work on the dark side as we launch this so-called war on terror. And Dick Cheney and other neocons have been praised by Democrats for endorsing Harris, and they're saying, see, even these people care about preserving democracy from Donald Trump. I think it's missing the real story here. Since the end of the Obama era, we've seen neocons recognize that actually Democrats are pretty good for their interests. That the wars that Joe Biden is facilitating in the Middle East right now are the lifelong dream of people like Dick Cheney. They want to redraw the maps in the Middle East. They want an Israel-centric American domination of the Middle East. So, I think the American press is missing something with this, love fest between the Dick Cheney, Kamala Harris camp, which is that Dick Cheney can endorse Kamala Harris because she's a part of a policy that they actually want in the world. Donald Trump, for all of his lunacy and stuff, has repeatedly expressed concern about forever wars. Now, I don't think Donald Trump is a dove by any stretch of the imagination. I do think he's a very dangerous individual. He radically expanded drone strikes. He used the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, but he is a circuit breaker of sorts, and he scares the elite power structure. I'm not saying this in any way to endorse Donald Trump. I'm saying that you can understand, and the truth is darker than we're told. What does Dick Cheney have in common with the Democratic Party? The answer is a lot. And that says something about Obama normalizing assassination for many liberals. You can go back and look at the opinion polls. When Obama was waging these drone wars, he had convinced so many liberals that this was a smarter way to wage American wars that you had huge percentages of liberals saying they support targeted assassination. This is something that if you had Cheney and Bush in power, you wouldn't have achieved. Would Donald Trump have been able to facilitate this genocidal war that Israel is waging for an entire year? Would there have been more pushback? Those are serious questions. I think that had Trump been doing the same things as Biden, you would have seen a lot more protest. And instead, you see this attempt to tell people to shut up. Don't raise your voice about Kamala Harris's support because you're going to give Donald Trump the White House. That's not democracy. People have a right to vote how they want to vote. And the time when you have power as a voter is before you go to into the secret room to vote on election day.
One of the questions that I've been looking at recently is where the Arab American vote in the US goes, particularly after the protests earlier this year, and there were a lot of people who were annoyed with how that was handled, and also the lack of a ceasefire now. A lot of people have just assumed that the Arab American population will vote for Kamala Harris. I've spoken to so many recently who've said, I'm not going to vote either way. By default, perhaps that means that Donald Trump gets more votes. Where do they go from here?
Yeah, we call it vote shaming, that if you don't vote for Kamala Harris, you're responsible for Donald Trump. Well, Kamala Harris has had an entire year of this genocidal war to listen to what people are saying. It's not just Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. I would say that any good soul in this country that is watching a genocide in real time, that is being filmed by journalists who are simultaneously being hunted by Israel, them being killed and their families, that if you don't believe that there's an epic moral issue in front of us in this election right now in the form of this Gaza war, then I don't know what reality you're living in. The Democrats have a PhD in blaming everyone but themselves for their electoral losses. In 2000, it was Ralph Nader took the election away from Al Gore. Well, no, the Democrats ran a bad campaign. There was chicanery in Florida with the vote count. And then you had a Supreme Court hand the White House to Bush. That's not Ralph Nader's fault. Hillary Clinton in 2016, it was Vladimir Putin and it was Jill Stein of the Green Party that caused us to lose. Well, no, they ran a bad campaign. They chose a candidate that was deeply polarizing, who many people, liberals and the left, didn't like because they considered her an ultra-militaristic Secretary of State when Obama was president. So at every turn, the Democrats looked to blame anyone except themselves for their electoral losses. So the notion that like Cornel West or Jill Stein could be responsible for Donald Trump assuming power, when the candidate, Kamala Harris, has been a part of this genocidal policy for a year, has been given ample opportunity in the limited number of interviews she's done to denounce some part of the policy or explain how she would be different, to say, no, I would have done everything the same. That sends a message to many voters, especially Palestinian Americans, and now Lebanese Americans. We actually don't care about what's happening to you or your families abroad, that you have to vote for us, or you're the one that caused this. I mean, think about how anti-democratic, undemocratic that is, to imply that if a voter that you don't listen to doesn't vote for you, that they're responsible for the outcome. You know, if the Democrats wanted to address this situation, they would have handled it differently in places like Michigan or in their interaction with Arab and Muslim American leaders. I don't know if it will be the definitive thing that causes, you know, Harris to lose if she does, but it's a very, very serious threat to her victory, and they're handling it in the worst possible way by saying, we actually don't care to listen to you about this.
I'm going to end on a slightly brighter note. Julian Assange.
Are there any in the world right now? Yeah.
Julian Assange, so relatively bright.
It is bright because he's free.
Yeah, exactly. And he recently made his first public statement since he was released. I'm just going to read you the statement that he gave. He said, and I quote, "I want to be totally clear. I am not free today because the system worked. I am free today after years of incarceration because I pled guilty to journalism. I pled guilty to seeking information from a source. I pled guilty to obtaining information from a source. And I pled guilty to informing the public what that information was. I did not plead guilty to anything else." Now, you've reported on whistleblowers and you've published their work. Is Julian Assange's freedom something to celebrate, or is it something, or does how he became free become something for his jailers to be celebrating?
There was an epic smear campaign against Julian Assange that sought to erase the real reason why powerful governments, primarily the United States, wanted him either locked up or dead. And that was that he exposed American war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but also in a less talked about sphere of politics, which is how America uses its soft power around the world to engage in dirty tricks and coups and fomenting unrest in countries across the globe. Assange should go down in history as one of the most consequential figures of this era in terms of taking on the most powerful nation in the world, revealing its secrets, and in the process allowing the world ever so slightly to look into the machinery of power of the dominant empire of our time, the United States. There's all kinds of criticisms any of us can levy against any public figure, and Assange shouldn't be immune from that. But let's be clear, the point of the smear campaign against him was not rooted in, we want justice. It was rooted in, we want him shut down. We want to send a message to everyone else that if you publish our secrets without our permission, that this is the treatment of you. And in a way, Assange, there was an attempt to crucify him in front of the world as a warning to whistleblowers and other journalists. Combine that with the mass killing of 170 plus journalists in Palestine today, with the weaponization of espionage laws in the United States to put whistleblowers in prison, and you see the architecture of what is a full-blown war against journalism and journalists.
Do you think the legacy of that is people are more scared to become whistleblowers, or people
For sure.
They're not more infused to want to do it?
The past years, you talk to anybody who worked with confidential sources, it's had a dramatic impact. It sent chills. The prosecutions of whistleblowers, the high prison sentences, the treatment of Julian Assange, it has fundamentally altered journalism. A lot of government sources are very concerned about leaking information because they see the book being thrown at people with very long prison sentences, including in the country that calls itself the strongest democracy in the world. So absolutely, it's had an impact. These governments have waged a war against journalism, and it certainly has had an impact that there will be people who have the temerity, the bravery at the times when history demands it to stand up and speak out.
Fascinating stuff. Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Center Stage.
Thank you.